Hello, welcome to the Physics Colloquium. It is my pleasure to introduce our colleague from the Physics Department, Professor Jeremy England. Jeremy looks at biological problems from the perspective of a theoretical physicist, trying to understand how the laws of physics it can potentially explain and constrain the various biological phenomena that we see in the world around us. His interest in these problems started while he was an undergraduate at Harvard, where along with Eugene Shachnovich, he wrote very nice papers on how proteins have special characters that he dubbed designability. Actually, following that work, we tried to recruit him to the graduate program at MIT. But first, as a Rhodes Scholar, he went to Oxford. And then as a Hertz Fellow, he continued at Stanford, where he had another influential paper regarding polymers, proteins, and how the behavior that they have in water is very important to the way that they fold and function. Following his graduate work, we again tried to recruit him to MIT with the offer of a Pappalardo Fellowship, which he again refused, and went to Princeton as a Louis Siegler Fellow, continuing his work on protein folding. Protein folding is, of course, an old problem, and people have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how it folds. But Jeremy showed that it's not really necessary to know all of the details of how it folds, and a lot of interesting aspects of protein function can be obtained by a simple model that he devised that within a few minutes on a laptop computer could give you the important features. So in 2001, eventually we succeeded in bringing him to MIT. In the same year, he was actually also recognized as one of the rising stars by Forbes magazine's 30 Under 30. At MIT, he made a courageous decision that he was going to move away from proteins and think about how biological systems are constrained by the rules of non-equilibrium statistical physics. Briefly, we have Boltzmann weights that tell us probabilities in statistical physics of equilibrium, and the corresponding non-equilibrium distributions, probability distribution, is something that people have looked at for a long time, and using new theorems regarding these non-equilibrium statistical physics, Jeremy has made important conceptual advances on how biological systems have evolved and reproduced and functioned. He is very well sought out as a speaker for his lucid presentations, and I look forward to his telling us about what he's been doing recently.
Thank you very much, Miran, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming today. It's really a great pleasure for me to get to tell our community about some of the things that we've been working on in my research group over the last several years here at MIT. So to start off, we'll begin with a question that in many ways has probably been on all of our minds in one way or another at some point. And what is life as a question is often treated like it's a very hard question or a subtle one, and of course it can be if you think about it in the right way. But in another sense, I'd like to put to you that it's, in a sense, it has a very simple answer that we all know. We know many examples of things that we would all agree upon are alive, and we also have many examples of things that we would probably agree upon saying are not alive. And of course, there are border cases, viruses and such, that we can always look for kind of the fractal boundary between categories. But at the end of the day, we have a lot of good examples of each. And so one practical approach you could take is to stipulate that we know what living things are as a group. And now the question is, what can we understand about what they have all in common with each other? We can, in a sense, try to tease out the features of that group that really turn out to be the main determinants of what makes us think that something belongs in that category. And I think that once we take this approach, what we realize is that there really are multiple languages that we have for talking about the world and what it is, even within the natural sciences. So I'm giving this talk in English. I would say most of the talks probably that are given in this room about physics are given in that language. And even about most of the talks about science at MIT are given in that language. And yet I would argue to you that if someone's giving a talk about biology or about physics, there's another sense in which they're really speaking different languages, because in biology, we take for granted that life is a phenomenon where we know what it is, and then we're trying to make sense of how it works and what makes something live or not live, et cetera. Whereas in physics, really at the outset, what we're starting with is a way of talking about the world in which the notion of life is completely absent. Physics bases itself at the beginning on very simple metrical assessments of the world. We measure distance and time, we count things, or assess some kind of quantity of something. And then we start to develop predictive relationships between those different numbers that we can generate out of the world. So while it's true that we can study living things that way, we can study non-living things using the same language. And so from the beginning point, our way of talking isn't really seeing the difference between those. So now the question is, how do you start to define that difference? It's impossible to give a talk on this subject without mentioning a very famous monograph written with the title, What is Life, by Erwin Schrödinger, which was possibly the first serious work of theoretical physics to try to engage with the question of, I wouldn't say actually so much what is life, so to speak, but more in the language of physics, what are the distinctive physical properties that are common to living things? And there's a whole lot of interesting stuff in that monograph, but the thing that I want to focus on today is that one of the things Schrödinger is famous for pointing out is that we really need to be thinking about thermodynamics in order to make sense of what's happening in biological systems from a physical standpoint. That's not the only observation to make, but it's a certainly important one, and it's going to be the inspiration for the rest of this talk today. So one thing that we study in statistical thermodynamics, which I think is kind of a temptation in trying to make sense of biological order, is equilibrium phase transition. So this is a sort of schematic cartoon of the transition between magnetic disorder and magnetic order and the orientations of spins in a ferromagnet. And when we try to explain this using equilibrium statistical mechanics, we have this idea of free energy as being the thing that's minimized by the tendency of the system in its Boltzmann steady state and its thermal equilibrium. And so if we are under conditions where this disordered low magnetization or zero magnetization phase has high free energy and this one has lower free energy, then we expect to favor this one. And we might expect, therefore, that as we are able to describe some kind of order or organization emerging in this equilibrium picture, perhaps we should be looking for some analog of that kind of a phase transition in the non-equilibrium picture that might pertain most to living things. And if we could achieve something like this, then it would have many implications. Perhaps the most important would be for psychiatry, because if someone ever said that they were getting to be weary of life, you could just tell them it was just a phase. However, I am not so sure that this actually is the way to approach things for another reason. I think that what we have to recognize is that when we describe things like magnetic order with a simple order parameter, that is one kind of way of talking about the world, that there's this number called magnetization that tells us everything that we're interested in. But when we're talking about life, this is really a complex bundle of different semantic connotations that come together all at once. So just as we can have a word like life, and then that immediately evokes many separate things that we really could put on their own barrel and study, many other words work this way as well. The word Belgians, for example, operates this way and produces a wholly different set of connotations which might each not be totally required, but together instantly evoke the thing that we're talking about. And I mentioned Belgians in particular because it gives me an opportunity to mention Ilya Prigogine, who was a very famous Belgian national who had a Nobel laureate in chemistry and really was another one of these early visionaries who inspired the drive to connect non-equilibrium thermodynamics and some understanding of biological order. And I think that Prigogine's contributions early in the development of the field certainly pointed in a very productive direction, but it was several decades before the theoretical machinery of the physics really caught up to the point where we could start to think about studying some of these kinds of issues, which really are the bread and butter of what we think of life as really consisting of. So I'm going to try to talk today to you about two different ways of understanding some of these different things that we think of as being the behaviors most distinctive of life. That life forms fast and then sticks around, that life self-replicates and makes copies of itself, that life harvests energy from its surroundings, that you see a lot of cyclical flows that break detailed balance in them. You see anticipation of the future, that they predict their future in accurate ways. There are a lot of different things that we would say those are maybe quite distinctive of, if not unique to life, but each one of them is a separate behavior that we could study. And I think the question now is, how do we start to drill down on any one of these behaviors and understand it as a physical phenomenon and give it a description in that language? And if we're talking about whether it's possible, then the second law of thermodynamics is a very tempting tool to try to make use of, because the second law is very good at permitting and forbidding things when you don't know very much about the system that you're working with. But you could also think about, in addition to that, not just what permits something according to assumptions about our physical laws that we're governed by, but also what is going to give you the opportunity to cultivate a phenomenon, right? How do you define the physical conditions in which a certain kind of behavior is likely to emerge, and that you expect it to be the sort of natural course of things, like rocks rolling downhill? And I want to specifically say that, let's say the lion's share of where this talk will eventually lead, I want to focus on one of these behaviors in particular, which we could call, if we like, energy harvesting. So to give you an outline of the rest of the talk, I want to first talk about some background in physics that's going to help us make sense of the rest of what we talk about, and then some general theoretical results that have come out of my research group in the last several years, where we have tried to start treating some of these issues that we think are most relevant to lifelike behaviors, a few vignettes, and then the inspiration for the final portion of the talk, which will be talking about a couple of empirical studies in simulation, where we've tried to really investigate some of the things that we've been finding about self-organization in specific systems, where we can treat them sort of like experiments in silico. So with that, I just want to remind all of us about thermal equilibrium. The basic idea here is that if I have a big collection of particles and they're sitting in a heat bath at some temperature T, then a very reliable modeling assumption to make is that after a long time, they should be what's called Boltzmann distributed, which means the relative probabilities of states should just be dictated by their energies. And when we are making this argument, implicitly what we're thinking about is that after a very long period of time, there's been an energy change from the starting state to your ending state, and that change in energy is going to be equal to the heat that you release into the bath on your way there, because by conservation of energy, that's the only place that that change in internal energy could go. But the question is now, what's different when we talk about non-equilibrium systems? There's never been a living equilibrium system. Living things do too many things that are basically forbidden by the physics of the thermal equilibrium state. So if we want to understand lifelike behaviors, we have to think about the non-equilibrium regime, and this is challenging because now we don't get to use the Boltzmann distribution. We're generally thinking about systems on a finite time scale, and we're thinking about them in the presence perhaps of applied fields that are changing the forces on the system over time, or also that there might be chemical fluxes going through the system and converting one thing to another thing. All these ways of essentially doing work on the system while it's evolving over time. And so if you, for example, are applying a field and changing some force, and you start in this state and you travel over to this one, the heat that you release into your surroundings is now going to be related not only to the internal energy change, but also to the work that you did, because conservation of energy now gives you different opportunities to shuffle energy around from one place to another. Now, you might be asking me why I'm obsessed with the heat here, and we'll see in due course why that is the most relevant thing, because what we're going to be interested in now is what is the relative probability of this state versus that one, given a particular way of driving the system and the interactions between these particles, if I only get to watch the system for a finite amount of time. And the thing that we want to exploit here is a very important and sometimes neglected basic symmetry of the dynamical laws that we have for the matter that we usually study in the world, that we are able to write down classically, and there are analogs of this quantum mechanically, that if I have Hamilton's equations describing the coordinates of a system, position and momentum, and I'm just following some kind of Newtonian or Hamiltonian trajectory, whatever you want to call it, there's a symmetry where if I map momentum to its additive inverse and time to its additive inverse at the same time, then I get a reproduction of the same equations of motion as I had before. And what that means in layman's terms is basically that anything that is allowed as a solution to the equations of motion, I also have to allow as a solution the rewind movie of what I'm looking at. So this is totally intuitive if I'm talking about a cannonball going upward, that just as I could throw a cannonball upward, I could also drop a cannonball from its pinnacle and watch it go back in the other direction. But when we start thinking about living things, we do a little sort of skip for a second, because at first it seems like now we're dealing with systems that don't behave this way, right? Because going forward, a plant growing seems perfectly normal, although this is a sped up movie. But going backward is something we don't really see. We don't see plants ungrow into seeds while sending solar energy back out into their surroundings and turning oxygen into carbon dioxide, right? So if that doesn't happen, the question is why? And that is not something where, that's a sort of cutting edge mystery. The issue here is that this movie focuses us on the plant, but in fact there's other stuff happening which we don't see in the movie because it's basically invisible. There's a bath of an atmosphere around this plant which has heat in it and which has different kinds of particles in it. And there are exchanges happening between the plant and its surroundings that are crucial to understanding this time reversal symmetry breaking that we apparently see in the statistical tendency of plant-like matter. So the way that we can think about this more formally has really not been available to us until landmark works that maybe you could argue started to get in the right direction in the 1980s, but I think the capstone of this evolution and understanding came with this breakthrough work by Gavin Crooks in 2001, I believe. I think there are two papers, but in any case. So the basic idea here is that when we were talking about thermal equilibrium, we were thinking about the probabilities of states. And it turns out that when we start thinking about non-equilibrium, the crucial change in how we think about things, and this is an observation that was pointed out by Gavin Crooks himself in this room not so many years ago when he came and gave a colloquium here, you have to start thinking about trajectories. You have to think about a sequence of states. You have to start thinking about, in a sense, a movie of states that you go through. So I could start and go from I to j to k, or I could go from k to j to I. And I could also think about applying my external field according to a certain sequence of jabs and pushes, and I could reverse that sequence when I talk about going back in the reverse direction. And both of these things dynamically, in some model of what the probabilities of things happening are going to be, these are going to have probabilities that can be compared to each other. And we can look at the ratio of the probability of this forward movie to this reverse movie. And what Crooks was able to show is that there's a quantitative relationship between the relative probabilities of these forward and reverse movies, which is connected to the heat that's released into the surroundings when you play the forward movie. So the one on top here is the one where it's connected to the positive amount of heat released into the surroundings. And what that means is that the thing that's more likely, the direction where you tend to run in that direction more so than in the reverse direction, is going to be the one that evolves more heat into its surroundings. So in another sense, what we're saying is we pay for the apparent time reversal symmetry breaking in the statistics of the dynamics that we see using heat evolution. Or, to put it another way, using what I would call external entropy production. If I take heat and I put it into a heat bath at some temperature T, that is the thermodynamic definition of increasing the entropy of that heat bath by an amount given by this ratio. And so really what we're saying is increasing the entropy of your surroundings is the thing that you need in order to pay for this apparent time reversal symmetry breaking in the stochastic dynamics of this open system where you're only keeping track of the stuff inside the system and not of the bath degrees of freedom that are surrounding it. So that now gives us the basic theoretical background to carry us over into what we should be thinking about in terms of different results we can now try to prove about life-like biological behaviors. But before diving into that, I just want to lend a little bit more intuition to this because it's a little bit mysterious right now. I could just quote this equation to you and you could say, okay, I trust you. But there is a way of understanding a little bit where this is coming from. So if you think about it, if you're conserving energy in your system while you're making a transition from one state to another, such as, for example, if you're hopping from one side of this barrier to another using a pogo stick in this cartoonish representation, then it seems very sensible that it should be just as easy for you to go one way over the barrier than the other way. And indeed, That would be the case if you had perfectly conservative pogo sticks. And that maps very analogously to how this works when you're talking about systems that are not dissipating heat into their surroundings. They're not allowed to break that time reversal symmetry. But once you're using something like a jetpack to get over the barrier, you have a sense that there's an external drive that's acting on you, and you could exhaust that. You could be lifted up on this side, and once you're dropped down the other side and you've dissipated that energy, how are you going to get back over to the other side of the barrier? There is this breaking of symmetry from one direction to the other that is associated with the fact that the way you made the transition in the first place was powered by an energy source whose energy has then subsequently been lost into some heat bath. Because the whole point of the idea of a heat bath is it's a thing that still looks the same after we dump energy into it. It's the notion of a vast reservoir of energy whose statistical behavior is unaltered by the energy that we exchange with it. So this conceptual idea is the underpinning of this formula that we quoted before from Crookes. And now what we can do is we can take that conceptual understanding and try to start making sense of different things that might pertain to understanding lifelike behavior using non-equilibrium stochastic thermodynamics. So I want to start with a few different vignettes that come out of our research in the group, and then focus in on a bigger piece of theoretical thinking that was ultimately the motivation for several empirical studies that have to do with the self-organization of energy seeking or energy harvesting behavior. So first of all, one of the things you can do with the Crookes relation is, without too much rearrangement, you can turn it into what you might call an extension of the second law of thermodynamics. So the classic second law of thermodynamics that many of us have probably heard of is that the total entropy of the universe should increase on average for any spontaneous process, or anything that tends to go in that direction. And what we now are able to do is give ourselves, in a sense, more information about the bound on that total entropy change. Because what I can talk about in some arbitrary system is any transition between arbitrary states of my definition and construction, called x and x prime, and I could observe the system and look at the statistical tendency to jump back and forth between those two states. And that apparent time reversal symmetry breaking now sets a positive lower bound on the total entropy production, right? These terms are breaking apart into, first of all, an internal entropy change, which is really, we think of as being the sort of order or organization of the system that we're looking at. And then an external entropy change that we recognize from equilibrium changes, where we're changing the internal energy of the system. And so these two things together look a lot like a Helmholtz free energy change, which is indeed, at equilibrium, the thing that is going to be equal to the log of the relative forward and reverse rates of different transitions. But then we have this term here, which is the work that we're doing, the external work that we're doing. And so the form of this extended second law is now going to take is saying that in any system where I can quantify the statistical tendency of irreversibility in the dynamics, I can now bound what I would call the dissipated work. The work that I do with the free energy change extracted from it, this extra work that I'm doing that's just getting lost to the bath, that in arbitrary coarse gratings and arbitrary transitions between different kinds of states is going to tell you about the statistical irreversibility in the system. And so there are a lot of things you can imagine trying to use that insight to do. In the first case that we were looking at, it was to think about self-replication. And that actually isn't going to be the focus of this talk today, but I'll just mention to you, there's a very simple way you can think about modeling a self-replicator, a thing that makes copies of itself. You could talk about it having a growth rate, some tendency to make two from one. You could also talk about it having some kind of durability, which is some tendency for it to fall apart and sort of undo the change that it has undergone when it's growing. And you can also think about how much it's ordering its surroundings and organizing the world in order to make a copy of itself, which would be an internal entropy change. And lastly, you can think about the fueling cost, how much energy you need to supply the system with in order to accomplish that task. Because one of the things I think that we can readily recognize is that successful self-replication is a highly time reversal symmetry asymmetric process, right? I'm not going to grow effectively unless I'm much better at making two from one than one from two. And so once I have that relationship to this kind of a process, what I can recognize is that if I have a self-replicator that has some kind of fixed durability in terms of its tendency to fall apart and some fixed degree of organization, in terms of what it is made up of and how it's arranged, then if I want to increase the growth rate, I automatically am increasing the minimum rate of energy supply I need in order to dissipate heat into the surroundings and cause external entropy production. And so, in a sense, I think one of the interesting insights that comes out of this is that it is clear enough, I think, to a lot of us that if I want to make something that looks like life, I have to kind of order or organize the world in order to do that. And so I think old intuition is that organizing the world and ordering it is something you can pay for as long as you do enough external entropy production, right? You have to increase the disorder of your surroundings by putting heat into it at least as much as you organize the world to make the living thing. But I think actually, quantitatively, it turns out that that may be a relatively small contribution compared with something else, which is the statistical irreversibility of the process. The interesting thing about living things is not just that they're at low internal entropy. They're not just organized. They stay that way, right? An E. coli will grow in 20 minutes, and then some version of its carcass can stay around for thousands of years because it has a lot of very kinetically stable pieces that are not immediately going to fall apart. I would say if you sent it into outer space, it would do that, because obviously if there are things that could come and eat it, then it may not stick around so long. So the point here is that irreversibility that leads to kinetic stability after growth may be a much more significant portion of sort of the fueling cost of biological growth, which I think is different than the intuition that is sometimes suggested when we just think of it in terms of the cost of creating temporary order. There's a different kind of thing that you can think about, which is another vignette that came out of some of the considerations related to this sort of Crooksian idea that I was talking about, where we were thinking about essentially the problem of how you make out of some classical material that's living in a heat bath and fluctuating, how do you make something that acts like a good and reliable, precise clock? So basically, I have a system, and there are a bunch of different states that it could jump between, and I have thermodynamically consistent ways of making all the rules for how it does that jumping. And if I define this clock as being something where every time I jump from 1 to 2, then the clock has ticked in the right direction, and if it goes from 2 to 1 somehow by accident, then it has ticked in the wrong direction, I can define a current around that loop that is this signed number that measures all the right transitions and all the wrong ones and adds them up in a signed way. And of course, in order for this to be a reliable clock or any kind of reliable, precise counting mechanism or some generalization of that in, for example, the regulation of a biochemical network, it turns out there are going to be specific bounds on the fueling costs of that to achieve a certain level of precision. So it was speculated in a very interesting letter to Physical Review several years ago that there should be what they called a thermodynamic uncertainty relation obeyed by such a current. That basically, if I want to hold my rate of ticking fixed, and I want to suppress the fluctuations in that rate of ticking as much as possible, I'm going to be driving up the minimum cost, the minimum total entropy production in the surroundings that has to fuel that process for it to work that way on average. And this was discovered first numerically and speculated to be true in general, and we were ultimately able to demonstrate a more general bound on all the fluctuations, not just these sort of near mean Gaussian fluctuations, but even the rare fluctuations in such a system, of which this uncertainty relation can be seen as a special case. And so it turns out that in these systems, the degree to which you lack precision in controlling any one of these currents is bounded by the amount of energy you're willing to spend per unit time to sustain it in ways that gives you control over the rare fluctuations in such a way that you can bound them from below, basically. There's a different kind of problem that you can think about, which is not the precision of timing, so to speak, but rather, I would say, the fidelity of repair. This is another kind of thing that biological systems are very often doing. They're not at thermal equilibrium, as I said. Thermal equilibrium things don't have the properties of life. So anything that's alive is way away from thermal equilibrium and somehow managing to stay there. So the way living things stay there is by eating, and they have to be arranged in such a way that the food going in is deployed in the right ways to keep fixing things, right? And there's a whole story from the biological perspective about how that works. But the interesting question from the standpoint of physics is to say, if I have a goal of maintaining a system away from thermal equilibrium, so I have some arbitrary goal of I want to be distributed over possible states in a way that's not the Boltzmann distribution, and I take that choice as given, now the question is, what is the minimum amount of energy I have to supply per unit time to keep the system in such a state, right? How much does it have to eat, in a sense? And we were able to demonstrate a general bound on this quantity as well. So the minimum rate of entropy production in the surroundings, which is essentially equivalent to a minimum rate of energy supply for the system, turns out to have a very simple form once you arrive at it. There are two kinds of contributions that you get. One is coming, in a sense, from a measure of the distance from thermal equilibrium. So it's quite intuitive. If you're farther from thermal equilibrium, then you need to pay more per unit time in order to stay there. But then also, there are quantities that come to bear that have to do with the natural timescales of transition and rearrangement in the system. Obviously, things that are going to, even in their equilibrium state, tend to rearrange more slowly because of very high barriers between transitions are going to need to be corrected at a lower rate. And so when you combine these ideas together, you get a very simple expectation basically relating the timescales of rearrangement in your system and some kind of measure, a small number measuring the fidelity with which you are trying to hold things in a particular arrangement. And then your minimum entropy production ends up being related to, as it turns out, the log of that fidelity. And so this is the kind of thing you can immediately bring into a biochemical network and start thinking about what are the minimum energy costs of maintaining a functionally relevant sense in which I'm far from thermal equilibrium. So with that, I want to shift gears a little bit because we've been talking so far about little vignettes that you can develop out of different general results in non-equilibrium thermodynamics. But there is, I think, a core motivation that we've been working with coming from one of the theoretical results that we had in the group for the last several years that has to do with thinking about how to view evolution and its generalizations from a physical perspective. So when thinking about biological evolution, what I'm talking about generally is things that make copies of themselves and are subject to some kind of pressure from their environment so that some of those copies survive and reproduce and others don't. And what this gives us is an argument for why there should eventually be some kind of fine-tuned relationship between the system itself and its construction and properties of the environment in which it lives, right? It's not surprising that the fish that live in the sea are able to eat the things that are there because their parents successfully ate something there and so did their grandparents, et cetera. And so you have that kind of an argument to make about where apparent adaptation and fine-tuning comes from in the biological case. And the question now is, how would you try to generalize that way of thinking when talking about a system where your description of it is purely physical and where you may lack some of the hallmarks of the biological argument? So in particular, if you don't have self-replication, then you are in a much thornier situation in trying to justify why it is that the system should look a certain way at long times, because there's no argument for why it necessarily should resemble something else, right? Well, why you don't have grandparents and parents, essentially. And yet at the same time, it is tempting to wonder whether there's some opportunity here to talk about evolution in physical terms and then try to think about how to expand the field of view so that you could talk about adaptations in systems that don't have this self-replication mechanism. And I think the key points are going to be to recognize two things that we retain even when talking about a system that lacks self-replication. The first of these is that we still, in non-equilibrium systems, are very interested in the history of the system, right? That in order to explain how something gets a certain way far from equilibrium, we do want to make reference to the past and basically the antecedent structures. You don't have parents and grandparents, but you have structures you used to be in, and then there's the one that you're in now. So thinking about history is one thing that comes out, and the other thing is that you still do have sensitivity to the environment. You still do have ways in which certain structures in the system interact differently with the environment than other structures. So in particular, I can have a glass that is subject to a tone, and we've all seen something like this where resonance is going to cause the glass to shatter. And I think the key point here is that I could have taken those same atoms and I could have arranged them into a glass of a different shape and gotten a much worse resonance with that same tone. And what that points to is that there are different combinations of the same parts that are going to have a different physical relationship to the same external environment. There are special arrangements that can appear in some sense to be finely tuned and better, therefore, at absorbing energy from their environment. So when you put these ideas together, what you end up with is the question of, I have a non-equilibrium system that is evolving over time, and it's exploring this high-dimensional space of combinations, of putting building blocks together in different ways, and I'm jumping over barriers in this direction and in that direction, and the two ideas to combine here are, what does it mean that your most statistically irreversible rearrangements are going to be at the moments where you absorb and dissipate a lot of work? And also, what if that work is difficult to absorb unless you're in the right shape? what does that then imply about your evolutionary history that might give us the kind of generalization that we're looking for? So this was a conceptual backdoor into something that we were first motivated to look at actually by just rearranging the Crookes relation and finding something analytical that seemed to point towards this kind of an idea. Because you can write down a generalization of the Boltzmann distribution, as it turns out, for finite time, arbitrarily driven evolution. And you still have a Boltzmann term here, which might dominate in a given case. And so sometimes you get things that look like ice cubes. They look like they're at really low energy, and that's the qualitative reason they're in the shape they're in. And also, you have a term now which is intrinsically non-equilibrium that I would call a kinetic accessibility term. And what that reminds us of is that sometimes you don't get nuclear fusion in ice cubes. In fact, usually you don't, thankfully. And that's because you're very kinetically trapped in actually a high energy arrangement, and that's okay, because at finite time, you don't actually have the ability to cross that barrier. So sometimes what you see is dominated by that kind of kinetic inaccessibility. But if we try to hold those factors fixed, what's exciting now in this equation controlling the relative probabilities of two different outcome states is to think about whether there's a class of systems whose behavior is dominated by this last term. This last term, really what it's measuring, I would say, is the reliable absorption of work during the history of the transition. That if I go from I to j, then if I absorb reliably a lot of work with low fluctuations, then this term is going to make a decisive contribution relative to this one. So we're posing the question, in a sense, is there a class of systems where they would exhibit what we might call a dissipative adaptation, that they apparently end up in the state that they're in because that state is, in a sense, according to this equation, stabilized by an exceptional history of absorption of work. And of course, this is going to be the most interesting in these kinds of cases like I was already posing with the vibrating glass, where the environment presents, in a sense, a challenge to the system, so that you have to be in a special shape to absorb that work. So the place this is going to lead us now is empirical studies of complicated systems, where what we're hoping to do is try to characterize and define this kind of a phenomenon. And the claim here is not that all matter should constantly be doing this thing of getting better at absorbing work. Rather, the question is, can we identify systems that do so in a fairly generic way, such that they exhibit this behavior without our, so to speak, too aggressively putting it in by hand, and we're defining a generic class of physical systems where we expect this kind of behavior to emerge from features of the system that seem as simple as, so to speak, rocks rolling downhill. So the first system in which we try to look at this was a collection of Brownian particles, where what we did was we defined a rule for the stochastic formation and breakage, the random formation and breakage of harmonic springs that were connecting the different particles in the system. And the point here is to have something that looks kind of like a toy chemical space. And what I mean by chemical is that chemicals are things that are combinations of different building blocks, which by virtue of how they're combined have qualitatively different physical properties. So we're trying to reproduce that here by having a network of harmonic springs that is connected together in a particular way, which is going to, as a physicist would recognize, give us different response properties to external perturbations, because the natural frequencies of the system are going to be different. So we start with this equilibrium mixture of particles that has this randomly arranged graph of connected nodes, these different masses connected by springs. And then what we do is we pick one particle and we just oscillate a force on that particle at a certain chosen frequency. And then what happens afterwards is you get these different structures which look not equivalent to the ones that you get at thermal equilibrium. And now the question is, what happens when you assess the physical properties of those structures? So what we found in this system is that if you look at the normal mode spectrum of the structures that you achieve in the non-equilibrium steady state, meaning the frequencies that they like to oscillate at given the topological connectivity of all these different springs, then your choice of external drive frequency in turn brings on an emergent peak in the normal mode spectrum. So basically, you're selecting structures that happen to be good at resonating with that particular frequency. And you didn't know what those structures were going to be before the dynamical evolution of the system found them. You just put together a bunch of particles with a simple rule for how to interact, and the tendency of the system to cooperatively explore this chemical space and get stuck in those arrangements landed in and selected those particular structures for you. So what you see is this controllable energy-seeking behavior where these structures are better at resonating with their external field that's oscillating at a certain frequency, and therefore better at absorbing energy from that external environment. So that was a first simple model in which we were trying to explore this kind of phenomenon. And we were interested in the question of whether it reproduced our expectation from the non-equilibrium thermodynamic argument that we made that motivated this whole study. And indeed, what we did find is that when we looked at the statistics of transitions in and out of states that were at a high rate of energy absorption, that it was the transitions into the states of high energy absorption that had this sort of event of extra work absorption above the steady state level that was paying for the statistical irreversibility of getting stuck in those states once you landed there. So we did see a confirmation of the argument that we had made from the sort of generalized Boltzmann distribution that I had written down earlier. There's another system, though, where we wanted to work on even sort of further refining our notion of this kind of fine-tuned relationship with an external environment that presents you with the opportunity to absorb energy, but only if you're in the right shape. So resonance, at the end of the day, is a relatively simple phenomenon because the frequency is just determined by one time scale. So the question is, how much better can you get at fine-tuning once your matching to the environment, in a sense, is described by multiple numbers, and it's more kind of like a barcode or a fingerprint that you're trying to match up with in your external environment. So what we did was we made a model instead of a physical model where we had particles rattling around and connecting with each other with sort of bungee cords attached to them, which was the previous model. Now what we're thinking about is simulating a chemical reaction with many different chemical species. And what we do to do this same kind of challenging environment effect to watch the evolution is we introduce a rule that says that the rates of chemical reactions can be changed by a forcing function that implicitly is about burning energy in the surroundings in order to break the time reversal symmetry of the dynamics. So a given reaction between two things that have the same free energy should have equal rates in the forward and reverse direction. But if you speed up the rate in this direction from red to yellow, then effectively what you're doing is you're supplying the system with some fuel to burn so that it's permitted to break that symmetry. And so what we did is we made up functions like this that were random, frustrated combinations of all the different components of the chemical reaction with the goal of making it so that highly forced states were very rare, so that you can, in principle, get strong forcing from the environment, but only if you're in this extremely rare subregion of chemical space that you don't know a priori. And then what you do is you just put together a random network of different possible chemical reactions. So you just randomly generate nodes and edges that connect different chemical species and different reactions to each other so that you allow different interconversions between types of chemicals. And then you just press play after starting at a random starting point and see where the dynamics will lead you. So when you do this, you see lots of different things happening in particular realizations. But something that is striking that you sometimes see is a dynamics that looks like this. This is a plot of all the different concentrations of the different chemical species that you have in this reaction pot. And this is over logarithmic time, so there are these different epochs in the evolution. But eventually, you're going to end up in some kind of dynamical steady state, a fixed point where the concentrations stabilize. And the interesting thing you sometimes see is that, for example, a few chemical species end up rising way up at the expense of all the other ones, that they sort of outcompete and take over. And I will say that a priori, we made sure in all of these chemical rules to make sure there were no self-replicators in the chemical rules themselves. So nothing can make a copy of itself by itself, and yet you still have this network of different possible combinations, so there's still, in principle, the possibility of positive feedback at the collective level. And the interesting thing about these states turned out to be, and this is, I think, what we were hoping to see, but at the end of the day, with such a messy dynamics, you just have to look and see and do the experiment, so to speak, and see what happens. We saw that there was a tendency to see two kinds of dynamical fixed points emerge in a system of this kind. That basically, so the yellow distribution here is the external forcing experienced by a uniform distribution over chemical space. I randomly pick a location in chemical space and I ask what the forcing is, and I make a histogram of that. And you see it has the form that I mentioned, where you have typical forcing to be kind of mediocre, and then you have rare forcing that's very high or also very low. And then you run the dynamics and you find your dynamical fixed points and get stuck there. And now the question is, what are the properties of those fixed points in terms of external forcing? And interestingly, you see them split into two types. So in this particular realization, it splits into two types of fixed points within one system. That doesn't always happen, but it's representative, and it ends up bearing out in the statistics of many random realizations of these networks. that basically you either get driven to lower forcing than might be typical in a random sampling of your forcing from the environment, sorry, a random sampling of chemical space, or interestingly, you get stuck in fixed points that are extremely high forcing, that they are very rare in the distribution over all of chemical space, but you're statistically enriched to end up landing in one of those states. So even though they're very rare, you're much more likely, well, I should qualify that, but we could return to that if you want to ask questions about that. You are more likely to land at very high forcing than if you were randomly throwing darts at chemical space. And so something in the dynamics here is indeed producing this tendency to acquire, in a sense, a highly cooperative, rare arrangement of chemicals that would look to us, if we were just walking along, so to speak, and picked up one of these systems, like many different chemical components are in an exquisitely rare arrangement that happens to be good at harvesting a rich energy source in the environment. So we think of this as sort of a prototypical example of a self-organized metabolism, where you can get something that looks like it has gotten better at eating from its environment over time with startling likelihood, even though you didn't a priori have any kind of selection pressure of the usual biological kind to carry you into a state like this. So to sum up, we have talked about how there are general results that you can demonstrate in a theoretical way in non-equilibrium statistical mechanics and thermodynamics, which first of all allow you to provide hard constraints on how certain strikingly lifelike behaviors can be achieved. And that in turn can have various implications for how we think about the energy supply costs of different things that living things are trying to do. But also, we're given the opportunity to try to start designing conditions in which we may be more likely to see the spontaneous emergence of things that look like self-organized energy-seeking behaviors, and as I'll argue to, other kinds of behaviors that usually we think of as being the province of living things. And the key thing here, especially in the latter case, is that the dissipation of work is required for statistical irreversibility if you're not rolling downhill in an energy landscape. So if you're already zeroing that out, the interesting thing is the dissipation of work. And this is especially intriguing when you're working with an environment that is challenging, where it's possible to absorb a lot of energy, but only if you're in the right shape. Because then, in order to power some kind of collective feedback, you basically need to be moving along a particular track in that space of possibilities that has a particular structural feature that you'll recognize as being matched to the environment. So thinking about where all of this can lead us, I think there are a lot of different things to think about in connection with some of these ideas. So some of the things we sort of have on the stove now, and I'd be happy to elaborate on if people are interested in questions, are first of all thinking about whether this could lead to, for example, predictive computation. So in order to absorb work from an environment that has somewhat predictable correlated fluctuations, it may be that you don't just need to be in the right shape at one time, you need to find the right dynamical tendency in your response to the environment. And so it might be that you could imagine cultivating scenarios where you have an emergent ability to predict the environment's future as long as the system has been properly exposed to the statistics of its past. So that's one kind of thing we're trying to cultivate in chemical networks like the ones that I showed you. There also is a question of, more generally, in a whole field of experimental physics that's really exciting right now, how to make sense of what's called active matter, collections of many particles that are powered by external energy sources and are whizzing around and connecting together in different ways. There's lots of interesting collective behaviors there, and the question is whether there are general principles that govern the organization that you see. And one of the things that we have just submitted a paper about has to do with how that organization may be explainable if you think of it in terms of the reduction of a definable effective temperature for the system. That sometimes orderly behavior in a dynamical sense in your system can end up cooling things down in an effective way that freezes the system in that particular arrangement. And so even though you're actually far from equilibrium with lots of energy flowing through, you may still have a basis for seeing organization in a dynamical sense that you can't explain with the interparticle interactions. And lastly, we've been trying to think about conditions for the cultivation of self-replicators. What are the minimal ingredients in order to not just be able to permit self-replication, but to get self-replicators to take over in a system that initially doesn't have them? And interestingly, that story, in some ways, is less constrained by thermodynamics than we might have originally thought. There's an extra slide about that if someone's curious. So with that, I would like to thank many people who have contributed to this work and more generally been tremendously supportive in everything that we've done in my research group in the last 6 years. First of all, Dr. Jordan Horowitz was a co-author of 3 of the papers that I mentioned and has done a tremendous amount of work contributing to the group. And Dr. Todd Gingrich, who was one of the PLS fellows, along with Jordan as well, contributed to some of one of those papers, as well as Kevin Joe, who was a fantastic Europe undergraduate, who basically in the space of 4 months did an incredible piece of work that we made into a paper last year. And then also the paper about the self-organized resonator was by Tal Kachman, jointly here at MIT and the Technion in Israel, and Jeremy Owen, who's still a graduate student in the group. And the theoretical ideas that got this all going came in significant part from a paper co-authored with Dr. Kolya Perinoff and Dr. Robert Marslin, who are 2 alumni of MIT's physics program. And with that, I will thank these different sources of funding, everyone else in the research group, the physics of living systems at MIT, and lastly, of course, MIT Physics for being an incredibly supportive and encouraging environment to do interesting research. Thank you all.
Questions?
So, by breaking time reversibility, we now have a system with memory. And the question then is, if you put it into a complex environment, how much memory can you store into the system?
So the question, which is a very interesting one, is how much memory can you store in a system once you're allowed to break time reversal symmetry? And in one sense, there are quantitative answers that are being developed to those questions because people are very interested in the thermodynamics of computation as an active field in non-equilibrium stat mech. And indeed, one of the people I mentioned in particular, Jordan Horowitz, who came to the group after doing a lot of work on that, has really brought a lot of that thinking to us. So it's a difficult question to answer sort of in the complete abstract because it always depends on the system that you're talking about. So I'll try to answer a version of it that inspires me thinking about biological systems. So we, when thinking about computation, know that part of computation is about the ability to store memory. And in order to store memory, what you need are degrees of freedom that are kinetically stable until you do something to them that's deliberate, right? You don't want to store something and then have it thermally fluctuate into a different state. And so you need to be able to act on something, move it into a state, have it stay there for a long time until you come along and move it into another one. If you think about just a single living cell, and I now am drawing on my background, I guess, in studying protein folding, the classical idea with protein folding was that you have reversible equilibrium folding and unfolding. But of course, it's not actually true that most of the proteins in the cell are doing this. The plurality of proteins that fold in the cell, and really at another level, all proteins at that concentration need what are called molecular chaperones, which are hydrolyzing ATP in order to catalyze different conformational rearrangements in those proteins. And on shorter timescales, without chaperones, they would get stuck in all sorts of aggregated states or also stuck in particular conformational misfolded states that wouldn't function. So what you have in a single cell, in principle, is the opportunity to do a huge amount of bit flipping, if you want, just by moving proteins between conformational states that are kinetically stable without access to some physicochemical external drive like ATP. So I think what we should be thinking about is what does that potentially allow a single cell to do in terms of computations carried out by molecular herd behavior that it hasn't occurred to us to look for because our paradigm for protein folding has been perhaps a little bit too rooted in the early studies of equilibrium reversible folding. Yeah, just.
This might be on your backup slide, but we made a distinction between genealogical adaptation and distributive adaptation. But is it obvious that I should really think about those as different things in the sense that self-replication is a kind of challenging but nonetheless possible thing to occur? Why are they not?
No, you're absolutely right. So what I would actually say is that Darwinian-driven adaptation by self-replication would be more like a special case of a more general physical phenomenon. So if you have self-replicators, and if each one of those events that makes a copy of something is a highly dissipative event, there's a sense in which the story of a selective sweep can be told in thermodynamic terms as being an example of this kind of dissipative adaptation effect. And that's one of the things that we have in the first paper that we wrote about this. But the point is that in a system where you don't have a self-replication mechanism, you might still be able to see, in a sense, the fingerprints of strong work absorption in a rare state on the kinetically stable adapted state that you end up getting stuck in. So I think it's definitely about fitting one thing inside a larger tent.
I'm curious. So I think most of the things you said are also properties of, say, Belgium or any other country, right? You know, we have the internet and libraries like DNA. They store information, they grow, they use resources. So I mean, do you think there's a thermodynamic distinction between me and Belgium, or?
Well, I think what this goes back to partly is that on maybe my first slide or close to it, what I was saying is that basic physics does not recognize a distinction between you and rocks, right? That we're just talking about particles with positions and momenta, but well, okay, so thermodynamics may not recognize a distinction, as you say, between you and Belgium, but that doesn't mean that the distinction isn't meaningful or real depending on what language we're speaking. So it's a question of our choice of characterization. I think what, I would draw out of what you're getting at is the question is, can you predict the behaviors of economies or histories or of anything, this way? And I think what's very important here to remind us of is that the reason that my talk ended with empirical studies is because what the theory really does is it provides a motivation for investigating controlled scenarios where you have set certain things in place, where you know how energy gets into the system, you know the sort of special shapes that you need to be in order to absorb that. And I think when you're not talking about that kind of a scenario, what it reduces to is just that we're just talking about stuff that's really complex and it can do lots of things. So the simplest way of answering this is that, if you look at the world from space and how much, let's say, electrical power is being dissipated per square foot in Southern California versus North Korea, right? There's a big difference there. Both of those are thermodynamically feasible, right? So, we're not going to explain the differences there at a level of description that only sees the flow of energy.
Experiment that was performed to show that, well, before you put energy into the system, there was a particular chemical potential distribution of the system, and then afterwards there was a different one, which kind of split up this kind of little ground distribution into two different pieces. So you talked about this extremely high level. So I would like to understand a little better exactly what is it that really happened here, and what did you measure? What is that?
Yeah. So there are a few things going on here. This plot is a single random network with random environmental forcing. And what we do is we just sample random initial conditions, and we get the external forcing from the environment in the initial condition, which is, again, about how much we are randomly tilting the rates of reactions in order to break time reversal symmetry.
You're well below, above me. I was expecting something like, so we have water, and in the water there's something, and then you...
Okay, so like a concrete example of something that might behave this way.
No, I was interested in this plot. How was it made? I mean, is there something that you...
Oh yeah, so this is a simulation, right? So yeah, exactly. So everything we're doing is in silico. That's a huge caveat. I am very interested in developing experimental collaborations at this stage. I think if I had attempted to do so a few years ago based on the theoretical ideas, but before doing the simulations, it would have been a huge waste of time and money because I would have been very naive about how to design those experiments. I think we've learned a lot. And actually, I would say as a side point, I think really in silico investigation is emerging as a new kind of empirical science in this day and age. Because we no longer just want to do simulations in order to, let's say, match a number we measure in an experiment or do as faithful a reproduction of our model of reality as possible. What we also want to do is test empirically the complex consequences of sets of modeling assumptions, which is what we're doing here basically. We're saying, let's consider a certain kind of reaction pot with a certain relationship to the external environment viewed in thermodynamic terms. And we have much more control here in a simulation than we ever could imagine achieving in an experiment. It also may be that this is too much a toy model to actually map onto something in the real world, and that, the proof will be in the pudding.
So is there something that you could imagine that would actually be useful to do and where you could see something like this, or is there just...
Well, definitely. So I think that probably the most promising frontier for that would be in this class of experimental systems that I mentioned at the end called active matter. So people all over the place now are doing really interesting work, including here at MIT. So Nick Fakhri is a colleague in the department who works on systems like this. You can take systems where you have microscopic or nanoscopic particles that have access to an external drive that can do this detailed bounce breaking, this time reversal symmetry breaking, because they have a fuel basically. And then they have heterogeneous interactions with each other. And at the level of the collective behavior, you can get all sorts of crazy things to happen that are just emergent phenomena of the collective. And now the question is, what kind of predictive power can you develop over that collective behavior when you're so far from equilibrium and you're not able to use the language of equilibrium statistical physics to treat it? So I think that kind of an experimental setting hopefully is one where you can make an experiment where you know enough about how dissipative work gets into the system that you could maybe start to have some ability to tell whether you see this kind of fine-tuning behavior emerging.
Last question.
So I have a question about the implications for the beginning of life of this. So it seems like what I've heard about people who try to understand how life began, they kind of ask themselves the question, what is the absolute minimal physical system that can self-replicate? In the idea game, you just want to kickstart Darwinian evolution. And once you get Darwinian evolution going, then you get life, basically.
Yeah.
And if I'm understanding what you're saying, are you sort of saying that that's maybe the wrong question about that life may have begun driven by this principle of maximal dissipation without, and then self-replication came along later just as a special case of that, and you got Darwinian evolution starting later?
Yeah, so I love that question. In order to have enough space, I actually axed another thing on this list that gets at that exact issue. First of all, I would say talking about the origins of life in a forensic or historical sense, there's always going to be different models people propose of the past, and in some sense, I'm very reluctant to try to wade into that fray, and I'm much more interested in trying to do the proof of principle in the present. If you can develop experimental control over when you have achieved conditions where you can cultivate certain behaviors, you understand something about it. But talking still in those terms, I think what would be true is that if we could achieve that, we would, I think, reset our intuitions for how to think about that kind of, beginning moment for the reason that you're getting at. That basically, if I can get things that look fine-tuned without the Darwinian mechanism, then I may be having, in my current intuition, the wrong order of events. For example, DNA, we think of as a message that is copied, and that is because historically it was basically characterized first that way. It was the heritable material. But what DNA also is a tiny subset of the atomic degrees of freedom in a cell that has an enormous impact on the coordination of the non-equilibrium quasi-steady state around it. You could change 12 atoms in the DNA in a cell and get a huge change in the expression of a lot of proteins if you pick the right ones. And you could change 12 atoms in any protein in the cell, basically, any single protein, and you could make them molybdenum if you wanted, and it probably wouldn't make a difference at all to the cell because it's just one protein and it's in a big mess. So what we have there is an example of highly kinetically trapped degrees of freedom that act as centralized coordinators and decision makers for the rest of what's going on in a big coordinated non-equilibrium steady state. And my question is, can you get that kind of physics to emerge in a system based on something you know about the Hamiltonian, the interactions of the particles, and something you know about the statistics of the environment? And so we're chasing that now.